Rise from the Ashes. What a fitting title to cover on the revival of a series that fizzled and died 2 years ago. Ace Attorney Retrospective is back. And yeah, I'm skipping turnabout goodbyes. I just am having a lot of trouble coming up with enough to say about it to really justify a video. In fact, as I continue, this series will probably not even attempt to cover things in any sort of chronological order. I'm just going to talk about whatever aspects of the series I feel inspired to make a video on at the moment. And today that just so happens to be Rise from the Ashes. Rise from the Ashes is the last case of the first Ace Attorney game. Or is it? Actually, Rise from the Ashes was not part of the original game. In fact, all 3 of the original trilogy of Ace Attorney games were made and released in Japan for Game Boy Advance before Rise from the Ashes was made. This was a bonus case added for the Nintendo DS International Remake of Ace Attorney. That means that Rise from the Ashes had some unusual demands for its writing. For gamers outside of Japan, the DS remake was going to be their first experience with the series. A bonus case ending things on an anticlimax would be a very bad idea. So the Ace Attorney dev team was writing Rise from the Ashes to be an epic finale to a game that already had an epic finale. Turnabout Goodbyes is a beloved case for the fandom and is full of many iconic moments. And it's the case the entire rest of the game built up to. It was going to be a tough act to follow. Rise from the Ashes also had to be squeezed into an already completed storyline in a way that would maintain continuity and not contradict or detract from the rest of the narrative. This placed a lot of limitations on what characters could be used and what the plot could be. For example, Maya couldn't be Phoenix's assistant for this new case because at the end of Turnabout Goodbyes, she left on a train, and Phoenix wouldn't see her again until case 2 of the second game. Pearl couldn't be assistant because she hadn't been introduced yet, and Mia couldn't be the assistant because she was dead. On top of all that, as far as the Ace Attorney dev team knew at the time, this would be the last new Ace Attorney content they were going to make. Ever. In fact, it would be the last new Ace Attorney content anyone was ever going to make. Trials and Tribulations, the last game of the original trilogy, had come out in 2004, the previous year. Shu Takumi was actually adamant at the time that that was going to be the end, that Phoenix Wright's story had been told in those 3 games. He felt like there was nowhere else for the character to go, and feared the series becoming a shadow of itself if it kept going. Obviously, plans changed a couple of years later as the game found new international success, but as far as anyone knew at this point, this was it. The dev team working on one last bonus case for this port was going to be the last hurrah, like getting the band back together for one final concert before they broke up for good. So there was a lot of pressure from multiple angles to make Rise from the Ashes something great and special. But was it? Well, that depends on who you ask. Over half a dozen games later, Rise from the Ashes might still be the most divisive case in the Ace Attorney franchise. There's generally a lot of consensus in the fandom over which cases are considered great, and which cases are considered not so good. Sure, you'll get the occasional contrarian who will argue that Turnabout Big Top is good, actually, or someone who insists that Bridge to Turnabout is overrated, but very rarely will someone say the former is in their top 5 favorites, or that the latter is complete garbage. But whenever Rise from the Ashes is brought up, there always seem to be some people who love it to death, and some people who really don't like it. So why is that? What makes Rise from the Ashes good? Or bad? What makes it different? One thing a lot of people mention is length. Rise from the Ashes is a very long case, no doubt. It takes about as long to complete as 3 of the 4 cases that came before it in the game, combined. It's one of the longest cases in the series. But contrary to what many people believe, it's not actually the longest case in the series. That title is currently held by Turnabout Revolution from Spirit of Justice, the 6th game. Although that case is 2 completely different trials, which would normally be 2 separate cases. But even before the 6th game came out, even before Rise from the Ashes was made, Bridge to Turnabout, the final case of the 3rd game, which was made before Rise from the Ashes but comes after it chronologically, is about the same length. But people rarely mention Bridge to Turnabout's length. Even though it's a long case, it doesn't feel long because the story moves along at a good pace. There's always new intrigue happening to hold players' attention. That many players call Rise from the Ashes long suggests it's not holding their attention throughout. That it feels longer than it needs to be, maybe even feels like a chore to play through.
God, and I was still kind of burnt out from the first series, so I thought, oh, I'm just not ready for this yet, so I stopped. Alright, it's time to recover. Alright, to recover from the Phoenix Wright burn. The last game had that really long case at the end, which was, an addition. It wasn't in the original, I guess, Game Boy Color game, or Game Boy Advance, I don't know which one it was. That case went on for fucking ever, too, like, double the size of that Let's Play.
Most Ace Attorney cases are broken into 4 acts. A day of investigation, followed by a day in court, followed by another day of investigation, and a final day in court. The first day of investigation introduces all or most of the new characters who will be involved in the case and the circumstances surrounding the murder. At the end of the first investigation, sometimes it's obvious who the real culprit is, but you're never given enough information to prove it or understand exactly how the crime was committed. The first day in court, the prosecutor lays out the case against your client, and you have to counter it with any scrap of evidence and any contradiction in the testimony you can find to prevent a guilty verdict. As you do this, a few key pieces of new information are revealed, and eventually the judge calls a recess to allow you to investigate more. The next day of investigation is when most of the puzzle pieces start to fall into place, thanks to the new information you got from the first trial, and you get a much clearer picture of how the murder actually happened. The final day in court is when you put it all together and corner the real villain. Rise from the Ashes ditches this 4-act structure for a 6-act structure. A day of investigation, a day of trial, followed by a second day of investigation, and a second day of trial, then followed by a third day of investigation, and a third day of trial. Obviously, new characters are still introduced at the beginning, and the showdown with the true killer still has to happen at the end. So, what happens in the additional parts in the middle? Yeah. Story progression slows to a crawl during several long cross-examinations. Now, there have been long cross-examinations that fans love, and there have also been long cross-examinations that are notorious. It's all about creating a nice mix between searching for contradictions and learning new plot revelations and encountering new threats to keep the player on edge. If everything is just nitpicking contradictions, it can start to feel tedious. That's a problem that comes up a lot in Rise from the Ashes. Most of the first day of trial is spent arguing about the exact details of how the murder happened inside a parking garage. Then at the very end, a new character comes in and reveals the murder didn't actually happen in the parking garage. A couple of things from this segment do become important later, but most of it's just filler. In fact, with a bit of rewriting, the character of Angel Star could have been removed entirely. I don't think she's a bad character, but that's not a great use of time in a case that's so long. Of course, a bit later in the case, you have to rewatch the same bit of security footage over and over with that delightful jingle playing over and over. Always a fan pleaser. The pacing problems are definitely, in my opinion, the case's biggest weakness. There have been other cases in the series that have become completely defined by a single long, drawn-out, subpar cross-examination, regardless of their other strengths. And that's just one cross-examination, usually at the very end of the case, when the lure of catching the main villain is driving players. Here, it happens with practically every witness. Another thing about Rise from the Ashes that rubs some people the wrong way is a couple of subtle changes to established characters, namely Phoenix and Edgeworth. The first is Edgeworth being a part of this case at all. In the next game, Justice for All, Edgeworth has disappeared. He comes back at the end, but his sudden disappearance is treated as very alarming and disturbing. Phoenix makes comments suggesting that he believes Edgeworth is gone for good. maybe even dead. And when Edgeworth returns, Phoenix is actually really upset with him. Originally, Edgeworth's disappearance happened right after Turnabout Goodbyes. That case basically turned his whole life upside down. Him running off with little explanation afterwards and people being alarmed by it makes sense. This case changes that. Now Edgeworth stayed on working as a prosecutor for several months, like nothing happened at all. He doesn't seem particularly rattled by his experience in Turnabout Goodbyes either. Some things do happen to him in Rise from the Ashes that make him start questioning his role as prosecutor again, but it feels pretty minor compared to what he went through in Turnabout Goodbyes. The case also adds a retcon that Edgeworth explicitly never fabricated any evidence as a prosecutor, and the conversation he has at the end of the case comes across as a pretty typical instance of someone needing a vacation, not a particularly shocking or upsetting thing. So Phoenix's treatment of Edgeworth and his absence in the second game comes across as really odd and unjustified now. I understand why they wanted to use Edgeworth instead of creating a new prosecutor character for just this case, but it doesn't fit very well with how Edgeworth's absence is treated in the next game. The second character change involves Phoenix's behavior at the beginning of the case. He's depressed and has refused to take any new cases ever since Maya left. Phoenix doesn't show any sign of this sort of codependent attachment towards Maya later. Even when he reunites with her in the second game, while he's happy to see her, it's treated a lot more casually. It's an odd choice, and one that isn't really necessary. I guess it's something for the Phoenix and Maya shippers, though. Compared to the retcons some series have experienced, these are fairly minor things, but they're still valid complaints. So that's the bad stuff. But let's talk about the good stuff, because there are also some really good things about Rise from the Ashes. The cast of characters is pretty solid. Besides Phoenix, Edgeworth, Gumshoe, and the Judge returning, there are 6 new characters, all of whom are associated with law enforcement in some way. Emma Skye is the assistant in this case, and she's also the one who kicks off the story by hiring Phoenix to defend her sister Lana. The twist is that Lana Skye is the chief prosecutor of the city, and also possibly the most uncooperative defendant in the entire series. Emma is very similar to Maya Fey. She has a quirky, outgoing personality, a dark, traumatizing backstory to contrast it, lost her parents at a young age, was basically raised by her sister, and she has a very unusual skill set that just so happens to be extremely useful for investigating murders. This time, instead of spirit channeling, she's down with the forensic science, which is a little more grounded for the genre. Emma being so similar to Maya does make her a bit less interesting than she might otherwise be, but she has enough of a distinct and interesting backstory and well-written dialogue, including some funny punchlines and character interactions, that she still comes across pretty good. Emma being so similar to Maya is also not something that goes unnoticed by Phoenix. It's actually why he takes the case. Overall, I'd consider her to be a decent functional character. I cared enough about her and her role in the case for it to work for me, but she's not my favorite character in the case. In fact, I actually like that when they brought her back for later games, she developed in a very different direction from Maya and became a much more distinct character. Her sister Lana, on the other hand, is very interesting. She's a mystery for most of the case. As I said before, Lana is possibly the most uncooperative defendant in the entire series. She's being charged with stabbing a detective to death, and she's set on pleading guilty, even though her sister begs her not to. Why she would kill a detective, or why she'd plead guilty if she didn't, she refuses to explain. Lana acts cold, dignified, and authoritative, but she seems haunted, and it's obvious she's hiding something big. Other characters in the case include bumbling police officer Mike Meekins, cowboy-obsessed patrol officer Jake Marshall, bitter ex-detective turned lunch delivery lady Angel Starr, and last but certainly not least, Damon Gant, the goofy but brilliant and occasionally intimidating chief of police. I'm going to talk about a couple of my favorite parts from the case now, and that's going to involve spoiling the whole thing. So if you don't want to hear spoilers, skip to the point in the video showing on the screen now. Okay, so Damon Gant is the killer in this case. It's fairly easy to guess this if you apply some metagaming logic. Gant has final boss written all over him. He's the character who will be the biggest challenge to take down because of his position of authority, and he doesn't seem to serve much purpose in the plot before it starts becoming clear that he's the bad guy. He also has a suitably grand and intimidating character design, which, fun bit of trivia, was created by Kazuya Nori, the same guy who did character design for Haunting Ground. Some people have complained that it's too easy to guess that Gant is the one behind it all. I never considered it much of a problem. Half of the cases in the series reveal who the killer is at the very beginning. It's more about the how and the why than the whodunit. In Rise from the Ashes, the how and why involves a fairly complex double frame-up for a murder 2 years before the case. A man named Joe Dark was being processed at the police station for killing 5 people when a storm caused the power to go out, leading to him making an escape attempt. While fleeing the police station, Dark encountered Emma and took her hostage, but then a prosecutor named Neil Marshall came upon them. The two men fought. Emma and Dark were knocked unconscious, and Neil Marshall was stabbed and killed by Dark. At least that was the official story, and Dark was found guilty of that murder, along with all of his others. What really happened was Emma pushed Neil in the dark while trying to get away from Joe, and accidentally impaled him on a sharp point on a statue, killing him. Dark and Emma were both knocked unconscious, and Lana and Gant discovered the scene. Lana was horrified, and on Gant's suggestion, the two tampered with the crime scene to protect Emma and frame Dark. At least that's what Lana believes happened. What really happened is that Dark, Emma, and Neil all were unconscious from the struggle when Damon Gant found them. Gant took the unconscious but still alive at the time Neil Marshall and impaled him on the statue, killing him, then tampered with the crime scene to make it look like Emma accidentally killed Neil. Then he left and rediscovered the scene again with Lana, before they tampered with the scene again to frame Dark. Why did Gant do all of this? So he could blackmail Lana and have control not just of the police department, but the prosecutor's office too. When a detective wanted to reopen the investigation into the death of Neil Marshall because he thought something about the case was fishy, Gant killed him and used his blackmailing leverage over Lana to force her first to move the body, then to take the fall for the murder. This is pretty complicated, and now that I think about it, 3 people all conveniently falling unconscious so a 4th person can come along, kill one of them, and frame another with no witnesses was handled better in the previous case. But the tension that builds during the final day of investigation and the last day of trial as evidence keeps piling up that points to Emma, and Gant tries to trap you into his frame-up, is good, strong, and well written. I really like that it gives Lana Skye an interesting and believable motivation. There have been other characters in the series who are very uncooperative despite you trying to help them, and their motivations don't always hold up very well if you think about them. Here it works though. I buy that Lana would do all of these things to protect her sister. Lana and Emma's relationship is definitely a high point of the case. It's one of my favorite things about it. The way they both care a lot for each other and are each willing to sacrifice themselves for the other in their own way, yet there's this broken trust between them, and their relationship is kind of dysfunctional in contrast with Mia and Maya's, is handled well and it's very interesting. It's a shame that Lana hasn't been brought back in later cases to interact with Emma, because I would have really liked to see more of these two together, but as it is, I don't think Lana has even been mentioned in later games. My other favorite thing, and one I consider a high point in the case as well, is the character of Damon Gant. One of the best villains in a series with a lot of competition for that title. The guy is a bundle of contradictions. He says he hates criminals and is tough on crime, but he's also one of the worst criminals around. He's completely cold-blooded. He kills innocent people and frames other innocent people for the crimes with no remorse. Yet he's a nice, friendly guy, at least as far as his personality goes. It's not an act either. Once he's finally cornered, Gant actually compliments Phoenix and Edgeworth on doing such a great job catching him, and even takes comfort in knowing the law is safe in their hands. A lot of things about Gant are left open to interpretation. Did he commit these crimes because he only cares about himself, as he claims at one point while being questioned? Or is it because he's obsessed with catching criminals, and as he later tells Edgeworth, he believes that the only real way to catch the big ones is to go outside the law? Regardless, one thing's for sure, Gant is a formidable opponent. In the Turnabout Sisters retrospective, I complained about how Red White is supposed to have all this power over the courts and is blackmailing everyone to do what he wants, but he never uses that power when he's actually on the stand. Gant does not have that problem. He tells you that he has special privileges as chief of police, and then he fully exploits those special privileges against you. Gant is always laying a trap of some sort, countering your questions with questions of his own. While you're cross-examining him, he's cross-examining you. Both his cross-examination and his technically not second cross-examination, it's actually Lana's, but Gant kinda interrupts and just takes over, are examples of the right way to balance a long cross-examination section to keep it tense instead of tedious. So to summarize my thoughts, Rise from the Ashes has plenty of humor, drama, characters who are simultaneously larger than life yet well flushed out and surprisingly human, shocking twists and reveals. In many ways, it's Ace Attorney at its best. Unfortunately, in some ways, it's also Ace Attorney at its worst. Overly long, repetitive, tedious questioning segments that go over the same details over and over again, finicky investigation segments, and poor pacing with a bloated middle. Rise from the Ashes is proof that making something bigger doesn't always mean it will be better. A trimmed down version of this case probably would have ended up being a lot more engaging to a lot of people. Nonetheless, warts and all, there are enough great characters and moments that I'm glad I played it, and I would recommend anyone who considers themselves an Ace Attorney fan to at least give it a try. If someone was only willing to play one case of Ace Attorney though, only give the series a shot for a single case, I would not recommend this one. I'd probably be boring and just recommend Farewell My Turnabout. Well, thanks for watching everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, be sure to click like and subscribe and the notification button. Theoretically, that should get new uploads recommended to you. That's not always what actually happens, so you might want to just check up occasionally. There's also a backup channel on BitChute, and as always, you can check out my post-apocalyptic mecha webcomic at the link in the description below. This will be my last major video of the year, but I am going to make another short channel and life update video that I'll try to get out before New Year's. Have a Merry Christmas, guys, a happy holiday, a wonderful winter solstice blood sacrifice to the Eldritch Gods, and as always, stay sane and take care of yourselves.